Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. You guys asked, and I am going to attempt to answer your burning linguistic questions. For those of you that don't know me, I have a master's degree in Asian Studies and Linguistics from Oxford University. I also teach linguistics at the university level. That being said, I am not an expert in every topic in linguistics. You guys asked some really interesting questions, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can. However, there are lots of topics within linguistics in which I am just not an expert, but I will give it my best go. So if that sounds interesting, let's get straight to it. The first question is, I enjoyed your videos on language development since I have little monsters in that age range. An interesting video would be how that differs in sign language. Now this is an interesting question that I can talk about. So essentially, what are the differences in language acquisition for children who are acquiring a spoken language and children who are acquiring a signed language? I think the most interesting thing is not how much it differs, but actually how little it differs between those two modalities of language. So, for example, we talked about how children go through predictable stages of language development. So first they start with something that's called canonical babbling. They're repeating just one sound over and over and over. Then variegated babbling, then the one-word stage, two-word stage, and eventually developing full phrases. This pattern actually maps almost exactly to signed languages as well. Children who grow up in a signing household will start making kind of repeated hand shapes or signs that may or may not be a perfect depiction of the sign that may exist in like ASL, BSL, Auslang, etc. But they'll make repeated hand movements, things like that. Then when they get into the same age as the variegated babbling stage, they will start switching up their hand movements. Then they enter the one-word stage, typically around the same age. Some studies indicate that both hearing and non-and deaf children or hard of hearing children enter the one-word stage a little bit sooner. Lots of parents like teaching their children sign language because children can communicate in sign sometimes more easily than they can spoken because of the fine motor skills that are necessary to operate the oral cavity or the speech apparatus. However, children enter the one and two word stages at similar times for both spoken and signed languages. So a child might be able to develop a slightly larger vocabulary in sign language because it requires less fine-tuning than really precise tongue and lip movements that are necessary. But children learning both spoken and sign languages pick up grammatical features pretty similarly within a couple months of each other. And of course, there is a range for all children. It's not the case that at the 1 year mark, every single spoken language learning child learns their first word. There's a range in there, and that's true for signed languages as well, and true between spoken and signed languages. So for the first couple of years, language acquisition is pretty similar, if not the same. However, this is only true if a child is exposed to a sign language from a very young age. In the past, or sometimes in the present, when deaf or hard of hearing children do not have access to signed languages until maybe they're school-aged or even later, this can really, really hamper their language acquisition altogether. So back when oral learning was considered the standard for deaf education, in which deaf students were forced to speak or use spoken language instead of getting access to sign language, that really hindered their ability to learn a sign language down the road. This is because of the critical period of language acquisition, which is a hypothesis but has some basis behind it, which says that there is a critical period of language acquisition between about birth and puberty, and that acquiring a language after that age becomes significantly more difficult because of kind of just changes in the brain as children grow up. So that was a long answer to your question, but the short answer is there's fewer differences than you would think, really. The next question is maybe a video about the best practices of language learning. Love your linguistics vids. Thank you very much. I could make a whole video about the best practices of language learning. However, it will be really different for everyone. However, the most important thing is just time dedicated. I have been learning several different languages for many years, and my ability to speak those languages is essentially equal to the amount of time I've put into it. You can learn a language for 3, 5, 7, 10 years, but if you're only spending 15 minutes, half an hour a day learning it, I think the likelihood of developing fluency is incredibly low. One of the best ways to get in a lot of hours of language learning is through immersion. I think immersion is the absolute best way to learn a language. It's how I learned Korean, which is the language I'm most proficient in besides English. I lived in Korea for several years as a high school and college student after the critical period, so take it with a grain of salt. But when you are immersed in a language, it's a little bit of a sink or swim scenario. You are forced to use that language in new scenarios that you may not encounter in a classroom, and you really have to think on your feet in order to get around a word that you don't know or figure out what a new grammatical feature means in context. If you don't have access to immersion, then I would just say pretend or try to make it as immersive as possible. Things like journaling in your target language, of course, consuming media in your target language. So that could be TV, movies, reality shows are a really good one because it's not scripted. So you hear how people use the language in real world scenarios. So if you don't have access to in-country experience, try to recreate it in your own home. Read recipes, journal, watch TV. Try to expose yourself to as many different topics and scenarios as possible, because you never know what you'll encounter in the real world once you actually start using that language. So this question says, please look into contrastive rhetoric and any interesting cases of it. I have to admit this was not a term I had heard of before, but essentially contrastive rhetoric is the study of how someone's first language influences their learning of a second language. So, for example, I have learned Korean. My experience learning Korean is going to be different than a Japanese speaker's experience learning Korean because of the similarities between the languages, my cultural background, social background. So essentially it is how someone's first language or culture influences how they write or speak in a second language or how a common language is used. So you could also imagine that you and I don't have the same native language. So maybe you don't speak English and I don't speak German, but we both speak French. However, the way we approach French is going to be different because of our native linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Beyond that, I don't have much experience studying contrastive rhetoric, but it would be interesting, I think, to maybe make a video on in the future after I do a little more research. This next question says, I'm not sure if this is what you mean, but could you explain verb tenses in English? My biggest struggle with learning languages is the tense. Because I don't know the tenses in English, I just use them. This is, of course, a challenge for language learning where we learn our first language organically and then try to learn a second language based on explicit instruction and formalized terminology. So if you're learning French, you have to learn what future proche is or le conditionnel. Although I don't know what near future is in English or the conditional, I just use it. However, there is a lot of, so it looks like this person is learning French, and there is a good amount of overlap between English tense and French tense. I meant to print out a chart and I didn't, so I'm going to just look at it while I talk. Sorry. However, there are, for the most part, 12 verb tenses in English that fall into the past, present, and future. So we have the simple past tense. This is just using an ed. So I cooked dinner yesterday, I cook dinner today, and then I will cook dinner tomorrow. The continuous, which is when we use the ing, so this also includes an auxiliary verb, be, conjugated into the appropriate tense. So I was cooking dinner, I am cooking dinner, and I will be cooking dinner. These are all examples of what is called the continuous mood paired with the past, present, or future tense. We have perfect. So we have this in French as well. This is a mood that indicates, can't remember, it might be a mood or an aspect, I can't remember. But this indicates that something is completed, that something is no longer happening. So I had cooked dinner tells you that, like, I'm done cooking dinner, that's fully in the past. I have cooked dinner is present but also perfect, so it is completed even though the actual have auxiliary verb is in the present. And then for future, that's I will have cooked dinner. So even though it's in the present, it's indicating a sense of completion. And then finally we have the perfect continuous, which blends the perfect and continuous moods. So I will have been cooking dinner. It's a little confusing, but for English, the primary tense, the tenses are past, present, and future, and then it can be simple. So there's no extra nuance to it. It's just I cooked, I cook, I will cook. There is the perfect, which indicates completion. There is continuous, which is the opposite of perfect, essentially. It means that something is ongoing or habitual. And then present, and then perfect continuous combines those two. So you can imagine kind of a matrix where you have tenses on the top, I can't remember whether it's mood or aspect on the side, and you can pair any tense with any mood and create a couple different combinations, 12 different combinations in English. If you just look up English verb tenses, there's lots of images that will show something similar. You can see lots of different examples of the way English tense works. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that was a helpful explanation. So this is not really a question, but this commenter says, one thing I love is sentence diagramming. A video diagramming sentences would be great. I think that would be really interesting. I think that sentence diagramming is actually quite soothing. I learned it in English class my senior year of high school, and I haven't done it since then. So I would need a refresher, but maybe a sentence diagramming video is in the future. This next question says, what are your thoughts on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? Looking forward to the video. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is also called linguistic relativism, or Sapir-Whorf is a hypothesis within the kind of study of linguistic relativism. So this essentially is asking, how does the language we speak influence the way we perceive the world? So does the fact that I speak English mean I view the world in an Englishy sort of way? Not just the fact that I'm American and was raised in an American culture, but the actual language I speak determines my perception of the world around me. One way this comes into play in particular is the kind of debate around color words. So for example, every language has a word for black and white. If there is a third color word, it will probably be red. So if a language only has 3 color words, it'll probably be black, white, and red. However, what does this mean about the way they perceive colors? Why don't they have words for blue or yellow or green? Does it mean that they don't see those colors? No, it doesn't mean that they don't see those colors. However, there is some debate regarding how speakers categorize colors or how they group them together based on their language. So for example, in Japanese, the word aoi means blue and green. So you would say that the sky is aoi, but you would also say that a green apple is aoi. And for English speakers, these are 2 completely different words. The sky is blue, an apple is green. But it doesn't answer the question of, do you see these as 2 categories of the same color, or is the difference just not important enough to have a different word for? I don't know. The strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or strong linguistic relativism, which essentially says your perception of the world is entirely dependent on the language you speak is pretty hotly contested, if not entirely disproven. But there is some ongoing debate about how the language we speak influences how we perceive the world around us. So my thoughts are, language is not the only thing that determines our perception of the world. Obviously, I, as an American English speaker, perceive the world differently than a British or Australian English speaker because of cultural differences. I even perceive the world differently than someone raised in a different state than I do because of cultural differences. And there's a million other things that go into our individual perception of the world. I do believe that language is one of them, but I don't even know if it's the most important. Next question is, as a singer, I'm very interested in some languages that have sounds that other languages don't. And I'd love to be able to hear those sounds instead of just understanding they exist. So, I don't know if I can make you hear these sounds, but I can give some examples of some categories of sounds that exist in other languages that English doesn't have. One category of sounds that has a lot of variation cross-linguistically is what we would consider to be an R sound or a rhotic sound. So in English, or American English at least, this is as in red or water. Other languages are completely non-rhotic, so British English, Australian English, New Zealand English are non-rhotic. They'd say wata or some variation thereof instead of fully pronouncing the R sound. Other languages use trilled sounds, so Spanish uses an alveolar trill. I can roll my R's, but I can't roll them while soft speaking. I'm sorry. I've already tried. Check out my IPA video. French has a uvular trill sound, where the trill happens at your uvula instead of at the tip of your tongue. And then other languages have something called a tapped R. This is the case in Korean and Japanese, among other languages, where the tongue very briefly touches the top of your mouth and then retracts. Ra, ra, ra. So you could say you could trill, or you could tap. Ra, ra, ra. So there's actually an interesting video where a vocal coach examines a Korean speaker singing the traditional folk song Harirang, and he talks about how she's able to move between notes really easily within this word because of the fact that she's tapping her R's. If an English speaker were saying the same word, Arirang, it'd be hard to sing through that word because your tongue is all bunched up in the front of your mouth and getting in the way of airflow. I'll link that video in the description because, one, it's gorgeous. She is such a beautiful singer. Her name is Sohyang, and I think that Arirang is also a beautiful song. But it does talk a little bit about how the specific sounds of a language might influence how we're able to sing in that language. The interesting thing is that tapped sound actually exists in English, but we consider it to be a variation of t or d. That same sound that's in arirang is also in the word butter. Butter in the middle, or butter, litter, butter, litter. You can feel that the top of your tongue touches the roof of your mouth so quickly and then comes back down. That we consider to be an allophone of t in English, but is considered an R sound or a rhotic sound in other languages. From the vowel side, one thing about English is that all of our rounded vowels are back vowels. So oo, o are rounded vowels, but they take place in the back of the mouth or the back of the oral cavity where the tongue root is pushed towards the back. However, other languages have rounded front vowels. For example, French. So in French, tu is or the u in tu, which is the second person singular, is a rounded front vowel. And in French, this is contrastive. They have both kinds of rounded vowels. They have tu and they have tu. So one of those means you, as in the second person singular, and one means all. Tu. And in English, it sounds a little bit like there is like a Y in there somewhere. But the difference is that one is a rounded front vowel and one is a rounded back vowel. So one thing you can try doing is making that oo sound and then gradually moving your tongue forward in your mouth. Ooh. If you want to try and make that rounded front vowel sound. There's lots of other variation in languages that I don't quite have the time to get into now, but maybe I'll make a separate video about it. This next question is perhaps a study on the way languages evolved. So I don't know whether they're asking about how language in general evolved, like how did humans develop language, or more about historical linguistics. So I'll go briefly into both. For the first part of how did languages evolve, we really don't know for certain because we know that the use of language predates the use of writing by a long shot. So there's no written record and obviously no audio record of the first use of language. However, there are a couple of different theories. One theory is called the bow wow theory. So this is essentially saying that humans developed language kind of first through onomatopoeia while describing the sounds of the world around them. Bow wow, cuckoo, cock-a-doodle-doo, and language evolved from there. One theory is called the poo-poo theory. So like as in like when you poo-poo something, which hypothesizes that the first words were like exclamations or interjections. So like, oh, wow, ah, and language developed from there. Another theory is the theory that language developed from kind of rhythmic songs, like not word songs, but that people have historically for a very, 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 very long time sung songs while working to keep in rhythm for motivation, and to work together. And so that maybe there was just humming or some non-language singing that eventually developed into words. There's a bunch of other theories, but the short answer is that no one knows for certain how or why humans developed language. Now, we can do some research into, once we have language, how did we get from, Latin to Italian and French? How did we get from Old English to modern English? This is just the branch of historical linguistics. And one, it's not really a theory, well it is a theory, is the idea of Proto-Indo-European. So Indo-European is one of the largest language families in the world, if not the largest. It has about 3.4 billion speakers 3.4 billion speakers speak an Indo-European language, and it includes everything from English to Hindi to Greek, and is a very, very large language family. And there's something called Proto-Indo-European, which is thought to be the mother of all of these languages. So before all of these languages branched off and split, there was something called Proto-Indo-European, and as speakers of Proto-Indo-European moved across the world, eventually these languages evolved and split away from each other, and that's how we got English and Greek and Hindi. A lot of work has been done to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European and try and guess at what words might have looked like or sounded like in Proto-Indo-European, but there's still definitely a long ways to go. There were a couple more questions on another video, so I'm going to try and find them. I know one question was about, are some languages harder to learn than other languages? And the answer is yes and no. No for native speakers. So every child is able to learn a native language without explicit instruction, just based on picking it up from the world around them. This is true whether your native language is English, Chinese, Hindi, Greek, etc. However, once you have passed that critical period, certain languages are harder to learn depending on what your native language is. So for example, if I am an English speaker, it will be easier for me to acquire a more closely related language like German or Dutch. It's a little more difficult to acquire languages that are maybe slightly farther away, like Russian or Greek. And then there are some languages that are considered very difficult to learn. So this would be Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, Persian, Korean, because of how much they differ from our native language. So for example, English is an inflectional language. We have kind of short words that only take on a couple of particles, whereas Korean is an agglutinative language. There are lots of word stems that require these Lego blocks to attach to them in order to become a full-fledged word. English uses a separate word for the future tense, I will eat, whereas Korean uses a future tense particle that has to attach to a word stem. The differences in the way these grammars are constructed can make it very difficult for a speaker of an inflectional language to learn an agglutinative language and vice versa. So if you're an English speaker, you will have an easier time learning something like Spanish, French, German, Dutch that are more closely related to English than something that's not in the Indo-European language family. However, for young speakers, it's all the same. Any child can learn a language fluently by the age of about 4 to 6, as long as they have enough exposure to that language. I think that's all of the questions. Some questions I hope to go into more depth into in future videos. You guys asked a really interesting range of questions, and I'm definitely not an expert on all of these topics, so take everything I said with a grain of salt. But I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you found it relaxing, and I will see you in the next video. Good night. Good night. Good night.